Hello, this is Pastor Mike of Southern Oregon, and we're going to make another recording here for the Investment in Truth Review broadcast. Tonight's broadcast will be about the subject of the awful truth about voting. I previously wrote a two-part treatise on that, which is available at my Facebook sites. Before I get into that, there's a few housekeeping things I have to do. I'm going to start with this board where we're going to identify which recording this is. It will be code 2019 V for video 0002 on today's date, which is the January 29th, 2019. Okay. Let's get started. We got a lot of territory to cover tonight. The treatise that I wrote, like I said, it's a two-part treatise. The full title is A Treatise, Analysis, and Study on the Doctrine of the Biblical and Legal Basis for the Awful Truth About Voting. That is under code number 2018, because it was made in 2018, A0249 is the code number. I keep track of all this stuff by code number because it's easier for me to do that. There's going to be a lot of recordings and there's going to be a lot of writing, and that's the way I keep track of things. Before I get into the disclaimer, I want to say that we're trying out our new camera. We got a new camera, video camera. It came with some software. We're still learning how to use it. It was a little bit complicated for us because it's new software and we weren't for sure how to use it, but we figured out how to use it. We also have a ring light, which we're using now. We do not yet have the special microphone that we ordered. It's been ordered. We're using the microphones that came on the camera itself. Apologize if the sound quality isn't as good as it could be, but we don't have the fancy microphone yet, but we will have it. Alright, let me get into the disclaimers first. It's like I say, it's housekeeping we have to do. I'll just read that off. It starts off this way. The information provided herein is for educational, truth, and knowledge purposes only. No specific course of action is directed, which basically means I'm not telling you to do anything in particular, except the advancement of knowledge and truth. I now state and clearly declare that I am addressing the subject matter set forth herein as a pastor of God in my religious and ecclesiastical capacity and office, and that I am exercising my official function to keep religious believers informed of their various rights, freedoms, and liberty under God, and relative to their awareness and understanding of the various laws of man. Therefore, I hereby declare, claim, and assert any and all religious protections of whatsoever nature and kind, including protection from discrimination on the basis of religion available under the inherent, inalienable, primary, and subordinate rights and laws. The Remnant Church in Southern Oregon, Mike Benjamin's junior pastor, that's me, in both his personal and ecclesiastical capacities, including his subordinates and personnel, individually and jointly disclaim any and all liability and or responsibility for any damages sustained or suffered by the readers or other entities or viewers, of course, not just readers, in the implementation of the teachings set forth in this video. The material is provided as a research study project for learning purposes only, and any implementations and or applications contrary to my cautionary statements are undertaken at the sole risk and peril of such readers and or entities. No statement is made or implied as to the ultimate outcome resulting from such implementation or applications. Okay. Let's talk a bit about why we need to address this voting issue. This is going to be sensitive for a lot of you, because what we're doing here is we're addressing something that everybody pretty much takes for granted is a good thing, and something that you've been conditioned to believe is the way things need to be, something that's synonymous with freedom and liberty, and also many other things that you've been told about voting, which I am going to be putting under some pretty strict scrutiny here so that we can take a look at it in an objective manner. We're going to talk about what does this voting in and of itself, does it relate to our inherent inalienable rights in any way? What about the people having a say in the way they're governed? We're going to be talking about that. As we address the subject matter, we need to look at it as a study project, and we will need to be, at least during the analysis of this study, we need to be looking at it objectively. So if you feel strongly about democracy and voting, I can understand that. I have some strong feelings about it myself. But what we're going to do for right now is we're going to be taking a step back from it, even if only just for a little while. And we're going to be objective and say, well, let's look at it afresh. Let's look at it anew. Let's see if we can determine whether there's some truths about the voting process that we weren't aware of before and that we need to take a good look at. And that's what we'll be doing here. We'll be roughly following the outline of my two-part treatise and study, which I of course I said is entitled The Awful Truth About Voting. All right, we're going to start right off with talking about the origins of democracy. In the year 507 BC, an Athenian leader, which I think his name is pronounced Clisthenes or Clisthenes, one of those two pronunciations correct, introduced a system of political reforms that he called Democratia, or rule by the people. This system, which came about in part due to the failures of non-democratic government, which would have been, empires and monarchies and things like that, because they fell into corruption and oppression of the people, and didn't always pay a whole lot of attention to people's rights. And the people pretty much got tired of that. And so this led to the people getting together and saying, look, we have to find another system that works better than this. And that's what this Athenian leader did. And he says, well, we're going to implement rule by the people. The way they did that is they would vote by collecting white and black pebbles, or little stones. The black pebbles, I believe, were a no vote, and the white pebbles were a yes vote. And they collected those into a voting receptacle, out of which the votes would thereafter be tallied. And then they would determine, how the vote came out. That process became the beginnings of the voting process as we know it today, and the democratic process. It is worthy of mentioning, especially because I assume that I will be at some point talking to non-believers, but I also assume that I'm talking to believers. I am a pastor, and I usually pastor to believers. But I'm not ruling out that people who aren't believers may watch this tape at some point and may be interested in this whole subject matter. Now, it is worthy of bringing to your attention that in the Bible, democracy, the system of democracy, is nowhere in the Bible supported. As a matter of fact, instead of resorting to a voting process, they would cast lots and decide things that way. And the casting of lots is an ancient practice going way back into antiquity, where not only were issues decided, but it was also used to determine the divine will of whatever deity people would worship. And but the whole point of all that is, well, why do we bring that up? Well, we bring it up because rather than resort to a democratic voting process in biblical practice, they would cast lots instead, which is in and of itself a statement about how they didn't resort to democracy and voting. Now let us pin something down. I think it's pretty important. Democracy, of course, demo means the people, and the last part of cracy means to rule by the people. It always involves voting, and it unavoidably brings us to a three-tier system, which is democracy, comes to voting, comes to majority vote. The reason we need to really be clear on that is that the whole paradigm of democracy is the majority vote. And it's something that's very difficult to get away from. When you're going to talk about being in a democracy, you automatically start having to deal with a majority vote, which means that if a majority decides things, well, what about the people who are in the minority, who maybe didn't agree with what was voted for in the majority? What about them? Well, we're going to address that. You have to realize that when you have a majority vote system, it leaves some people out. Maybe they didn't want the vote to go that way, and they weren't in the majority, and they didn't agree with whatever was voted on. It might be adverse to them, but they're still stuck with it because of the majority vote system. That's something that you need to really keep in mind as you go through this whole subject of voting. What is the proper application of a majority vote? Are not all people endowed with the same rights? Can only be done with your assent, which means that somehow you have to agree with it. Okay, here's the thing. Let's address that for a minute. In order for the majority vote to count against you, or for you for that matter, let's say the vote went your way and it was something you wanted to come out on top, well, then you're happy. The majority vote came out the way you wanted and you're happy. Somebody else who is on the opposite side of that and says the vote didn't come out the way I wanted, and I'm not happy. Well, because of that paradigm, you kind of have to have a situation where the people who are involved in this system agree to that kind of a procedure. So what I teach in my classes a lot is I tell people, look, all the jurisdiction that will ever be exercised over you comes from you, which means that somehow you agreed to it. That's important to remember, because you need to agree right from the start that you want to be part of this democratic majority vote system. And if you do so agree, well, then it applies to you. And that's important. That, of course, brings the flip side of that in. Well, what if you don't agree? Well, what then is your remedy to the situation? And we're going to talk about that. We're not going to go into it now, but there is a remedy to it. Is democracy and a voting process synonymous with freedom? We are told that. I've heard that in my life, and maybe you've heard it too. And they say, well, the democratic system is the best system. We're in a situation now where there's a big faction of the world that says that if we can turn the whole world democratic, that'd be a good thing. And I call it democratic expansionism. There are those who global democratic expansionism, which means that we want to spread democracy all over the world. Is that a good thing? We're going to kind of brush up against that idea. Is voting really synonymous with freedom? We're going to brush up against that too and talk about that. You need to know that right from the very beginning, even when in 507 BC the first democratic process was engaged in, there were problems with that whole system right from the start. Some people don't talk about it much. We are going to address some of it. it's obvious, that when you have a voting process, if you somehow influence the vote, which in what I'm getting at is if you influence it in a corrupt manner, of course, then the system starts to break down, and that's not good for everybody. However, people believe that the voting process is pretty much fair to everyone, and we're going to address some of that as well to see if it really is fair to everyone. It must be understood by biblical believers that the voting process is not in harmony with God. Now that's a pretty harsh statement, especially for people who say, boy, I'm just really pro-democracy and I'm pro-voting, and I just can't imagine a system where that wasn't part of our lives, and we need to preserve it. Well, there's of course a very good reason for that reality. Why I make that statement. It is founded upon the model of the conflict between the will of God as opposed to the will of the people. We must remember that God is a sovereign king and creator of the universe. Of course, he's not a democratic president or elected leader of the universe. He is a king. And that's a monarchy. Of course, I suppose we could easily argue that God as a monarch and people as a monarch are two different things, and I would agree with that. It is two different things. Therefore, for the genuine believer who accepts God as their King and Savior, we are bound to follow and obey the will of God. Our wants, will, desires, and likes are clearly directed to strive for conformance with the will of God. It's important for us to remember that the will of the people versus the will of God is another thing that we need to really look at very carefully. And also when we say, like when a vote is taken, then we say, well, the people have spoken. Okay, we had an election and the vote was taken and the people have spoken. But that is opposed to God has spoken, you see. Now, for the believer, we're supposed to stick with God. The will of God is paramount for us, and when God speaks, that's also paramount. And if we're involved in a system where the people have spoken, and the will of the people is the prime thing that determines the way we live, that could easily deviate from what we should be adhering to with when we want to stick with what God tells us to do and what His will is. And you get this problem of the will of the people straying from the will of God. And we're going to get into that. Now in Scripture, back in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 8, we find that the Israelites demanded of Samuel that they wanted a human king like the other nations. Samuel spoke the demands of the people into the ears of the Lord, to which the Lord said to Samuel, "Give the people what they asked for." He added that it wasn't a rejection of Samuel, but rather it was a rejection of the Lord Himself, so that He should not reign over them. We must bear in mind that the people were warned about what manner of king they will have chosen to reign over them, that he would take from them the best they had, take their sons to fight for him, and that in essence corruption at various levels would become part of such a government, straying from the will of God. History has shown us that indeed that is the case. That's what happened. Give particular emphasis to the straying from the will of God component of all this. I'm going to talk about Samuel for a minute. I think it's kind of important that you know a little bit about Samuel. Samuel, whose name means asked of God, offering of God, or appointed of God, was one of the earliest Israelite prophets after Moses. He is known as the man who had God's ear. Samuel was a Nazirite. This comes from 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 11. and his free growth of hair indicated the complete dedication of all the power of the head of God. Samuel's ministry was fourfold. He was a prophet, he was an intercessor, he was a priest of the Most High God, and he was a judge over Israel. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, it also makes it clear that Samuel had become old, and his sons, who were corrupt judges over Israel, took bribes and engaged in unrighteous conduct, and therefore did not walk in the ways of Samuel. Thus the people came to Samuel and said, well, we want a king like the other nations because of the corruptions that had gone on there. Originally, in order to be clear about this, before this occurrence happened, what they talk about here in Samuel, God was the king over Israel directly, and of course there were people involved under God who oversaw and administered that, but God was a direct king over Israel up to that point, until the people said, we want a king, a human king like the other nations, because they were unhappy with some of the corruption, I guess, from which would, I'm not sure of all the corruption that went on there, but I assumed that there was corruption. Let me go into a little bit more about what God's prediction about if they chose a human king, what would happen to them. This is recorded in the book of 1 Samuel in chapter 8, and I'm going to read some of it so you can get an idea of what the Bible says about this. So in chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second son was Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, and turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord." Then in verse 7, this is a key verse, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." This is a really important verse. And we're going to see that when the sovereignty and kingship of God is rejected in favor of the sovereignty and kingship of man, things start to go really wrong. Now let's go on with these verses. "According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them." And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king, and said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be his confectionaries, and to be his cooks, and to be his bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your oliveyards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your, let's see, where was I here? And he will take a tenth of your seed, and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses, meaning donkeys, and put them to his work. And he will take 1/10 of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye will cry out in that day because of your king which you shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our kings may judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, Go every man to his city. Now, I'm going to, let me take a look here. I'm going to reread part of this because it's important. What we've got going on here is that the people asked for a human king. Samuel didn't like it, but he went and told the Lord what was said, and because he's a prophet, and went to the Lord, he said, here's what the people said, and he says, okay, give them what they want. What's really important is verse 18, where it says, And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Now that's pretty important. First you have the verse where it says that you reject the Lord as your king. Then he says, whenever you've chosen this human king, and he does all this stuff to you, and then you're going to cry out and say, boy, we just, look what happened. We chose as the king, and this is what happens. And then you're going to cry out because of the oppression and the unfair treatment and the corruption that goes on. And what's important here, it says, the Lord will not hear you in that day. Now, I want you to remember that. I want you to think about it when you realize that long ago, the people rejected the Lord, chose a human king, the corruption happened, and he took the best of what the people had, and in that day it says here in these verses that he demanded 10%. He says 1/10 of your sheep, and 1/10 of your vineyards, and 1/10 of your olives, and 1/10 of this and that. Well, I'd like to point out to you that in today's world, you would be so lucky as to have the government only take 1/10. You see, the government actually takes more than 1/10. So, and of course I'm talking about the taxes and all the other things that you end up having to pay for, which are either taxes or other kind of monetary duties that the people are required to pay. And it amounts to more than 1/10. Then verse 19 it says, nevertheless the people after they had been told what the king would do, they said the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel and said, Nay, but we will have a king over us. This is free will and choice. Remember that when you are oppressed by corrupt government, when you are oppressed in other ways, in monetary ways, and in other ways your rights are being taken away or whatever it is, and that you shall cry out in that day that the injustices are being done to you, and you're going to cry out to the Lord and say, Lord, how can you let this happen? How can we be in this situation where you're not protecting us from this kind of behavior and this kind of oppression? And then the scriptures say here that the Lord will not hear you in that day. You see. Now, this is really important to remember whenever you think about the situation you find yourself in. By free will we have chosen this, and I realize that this was a long time ago, and it was chosen by people long before you, but we just keep choosing it. As time goes on, the choice just keeps on being renewed down through history. And if we don't realize that and do something about it and make some right choices by understanding what's going on, well, you know, we kind of brought this on ourselves, and I want people to understand that. All right, let's move on here and talk about of course, right after this happened, Samuel picked out a Benjamite by the name of Saul, who was anointed king over Israel. That's important to know. So the aftermath of all this was that they did anoint a human king to be a king over Israel. Now, let's go on to another key statement, which I think is important for you to know. For God's people, this whole event that occurred is the beginning of the separation of church and state. By that I mean separation of God from the state, from the state rule of man. Because God's been rejected, he's no longer king over Israel. Now you have a separation from God, and now the rule of man is in charge. By that kind of separation of church and state. As you'll find out as we go on, there are more than one way to explain what separation of church and state is. Please take a moment to think about what I've said about this separation of church and state. We use that term a lot, and now you have a whole other way of looking at separation of church and state. It kind of starts right there for believers anyway, where we have rejected God. Let me state for the record that this very account has placed God's people under man's sovereignty for countless generations in history. Perhaps now you can see what separation from God's sovereignty has done to us. It's important for us to be very clear on this. We have an opportunity for the first time in many hundreds of years to return unto the waiting arms of our jurisdictional sovereign king, who is God. And I'm going to talk about that and kind of explain how that's possible to do. And until we do that, especially as believers, until we decide to do that and we say, look, we want God as our king, again, I know, now Pastor Mike has just explained to us how God got rejected. Well, we want him back again. If you do, that's really good. We're going to talk about that. All right. I'm reading here my notes for a second. Let's see. It's not just the kingship of God, it's also, of course, the authority of his holy word. The scriptures themselves tell us that God is the Word, and the Word is God. That's in the book of John, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Therefore, let it be forever clear that the Word has the authority of God himself, because the Word is God. In our day and age today, the so-called separation of church and state, as it is implemented under the secular law of man, does not in fact exist, as I have carefully revealed to you in my writings and things like that. And I'm assuming that some of you have read some of the things that I've written and published on Facebook. It is critical that you understand that when, as set forth in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the kingship of God over his people was severed by the request to have a human sovereign king over them, that caused the separation of church and state, meaning God's sovereignty was separated from man's sovereign practices, procedures, and jurisdiction over the subject people. The reason, well, you know, I can't go into it in detail. It's in my writings, but I'll talk about it for just real briefly. The reason why it's a fiction, it's a legal fiction that actually is a separation of church and state in our day and age today, is because the secular government jurisdictionally rules over the church in many different ways. And for a lot of reasons, that's not the way it's supposed to be, but that's the way it really is. Like I said, this tape is about voting, so I'm not going to go into all of those details. There's another treatise that I wrote that does cover that, and we'll talk about that later. just remember that the church is not jurisdictionally separate from the state. The state rules over the church. It makes laws that affect churches. A lot of different things occur. I hesitate to go into the details, so I guess I better not. I'll just go on. Now, we know from history that non-democratic governments did indeed fall prey to all manner of corruption. That made the people desire to want to get away from the corruption, and their solution to that, of course, was to try to get around it by having government ruled by the people. The question that inevitably arises is this: will government by the people, in place of government by a corruptible earthly king, also fall prey to levels of corruption? Well, that's a pretty important question, and the answer to that is yes, it will. Try as we might, any kind of government with man as its central core figure usually ends up getting corrupted. For believers, this is what you have to deal with. When the people themselves stray farther and farther from the will of God, so in other words, the will of the people gets farther and farther away from the will of God, substituting their own wants, likes, desires as the will of the people, fueled by a majority vote, founded upon human sovereignty, we end up with a glaring conflict between the laws of man and the laws, rules, and will of God. We see evidence of that today. And I believe, that's something that we have to face. We just have to say, yeah, that does occur. Try as we might, we say, rule of the people in 507 BC, and of course, all the way up till now with the democratic system, it has its problems. And corruption creeps in. We get farther and farther from the will of God. Now, people who don't believe in God probably say, well, that's no big deal. We don't care about getting farther from the will of God. But for believers especially, and even for unbelievers, the truth is, the farther we get from the truth of God, the worse things get. And you may not think that it's true, but it is true. And you can really make a case that it is true. If I was to put together a case for it, I could come up with a lot of evidence for that. Allow me to point out that when the people become the sovereign authority, instead or in place of an earthly king as a sovereign authority, the people's sovereignty inevitably ventures into conflict with the sovereignty of God, as I have clearly established in my legal analysis of the Church of God treatise. Now, that treatise is pretty important. It's an 8-part treatise. It's under code number 2018A0207, where I make a biblical and legal analysis of not only how a Church of God should be established and what its status should be, which of course, just to make a long story short, a church is supposed to be established under the kingship and sovereignty of God, and he's supposed to be the boss over the church, not the state. That's how it's supposed to be. That isn't the way it is now. Jurisdictionally, it's not that way. Legally, it's not that way. And I'm fully capable of explaining all of that. Like I said, this particular teaching is about voting and democracy, so I'm not going to get into it deeply. I'll do that in another recording. Now this, of course, is partially our own fault, as we learned from what I talked about in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Clearly, we have not yet learned our lesson or thought the matter through to the genuine truth of the matter. That's what we're trying to do now. We're going to think the matter through, and hopefully we will learn our lesson, and hopefully we will learn that rejection of God is not the way, especially not God's kingship, and that we should go back to seeking his kingship to fix the problem. That's what we need to do. I am reminded of the well-known saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. When it comes to human beings holding such power, with perhaps a meager few exceptions down through history in the historical record, I have found little to disprove that saying, its applicability, or quash its injunction. Absolute power does lead to corruption. And even if you, well, put it this way, even if you have a good man down through history who isn't corrupt, and he does all he can while he's in charge to try to keep corruption at bay, well, sooner or later he's either going to die from an accident, or he's going to retire, or he's going to be gone, and new people come in, and then the corruption comes in. So the corruption just seems to be so resilient and so determined to come in that it does. Let me say that it is not when we hold a little bit of power that we are severely tested. It's when we hold great power that our track record on our watch is truly on the line. In a democratic system of rule by the people, we have representative government, which means that sometimes the people vote directly, sometimes we vote for representatives who then go into public office and represent the needs of the people and the will of the people and the best interest of the people for you, because you had voted them into office. Okay, hopefully they will do that. They will represent the interest of the people. At least we hope. At least it's our hope that they do. This process has been eroded to a significant degree by government appointees, whom we have not voted into their positions of power. And we still have, those are people that we have to contend with, and of course, like I said, they wield some serious and far-reaching power over the people. We have a situation now where there's so many of them, of these government appointees that we didn't vote into office, that it really starts to erode away at the idea of the people holding the power that you would normally have. Like if you vote for somebody who's supposed to represent you, vote them in the office. Well, if they don't do a good job, you can vote them out of office. How do you vote these government appointees out of their positions? Well, I guess you can ask the people who you do have access to vote for, like senators and representatives, and you say, well, do something about these government appointees who are oppressing us, charging us too much money, making it very difficult for us to get what we need, because they have become little tyrants in their appointed offices. And it appears that these people, these appointees, many of them have forgotten that they work for the people, and that they're not there to oppress the people, and that they have to answer to the people. A lot of them have forgotten that, and they just say, well, we've got power and we're going to use it on you, and we don't really care what you think, and we don't really care what you want, and we're just going to keep charging you more money for permits, and we're going to charge you more money for licenses, and we're going to charge you more money for all kinds of things, and we're going to make it tougher and tougher and tougher for you to operate. I hesitate to mention any particular agency that does this, but they're out there. It's prohibitive. It's so prohibitive in some cases that the average person can't even afford to do some things because of these high costs involved in trying to get permission from your own government to do one thing or another. And some people can't even afford to even begin to do it. And that is something that is an outgrowth of our democratic system, which starts to even move away from democracy, because you didn't vote for these people, and they're really exercising a lot of power over you. Now, as to voting actual government representatives into office, those who you can vote for and aren't appointees, who then go about their jobs on behalf of the people, we in effect have given them the power to speak for us in our name, place, and stead, akin to the legal effect of granting another person or entity a power of attorney. Now I have got a lot of experience with powers of attorney. I've written a bunch of them. And I've written a bunch of different kinds of powers of attorney. So what I'm trying to tell you is that when you vote a representative into office, you're pretty much saying to them, okay, you're going to be my representative. You're going to speak for me when I'm not there, and in my name and place instead. And you're going to speak in my name and in the name of the people, and we hope you do a good job with that. But that's the kind of power you've handed over to these people. They're speaking in your name, place instead. And if you have voted for them, you've agreed to that. You've agreed to that. It's just like signing a power of attorney and handing it to somebody else. Well, you've agreed to transfer some power over to that person. And in the voting process, you also have agreed to transfer power over to them. Something to remember. Something to remember. It's not just as simple as I'm going to vote for them and that's that. And, you know, everything's fine and dandy. Not exactly. What if the person doesn't do what you wanted him to do, but now he's got the power to speak in your place? Are you bound by it? Well, if you agreed to it, you sure are. You sure are bound by it. Best thing you can do maybe is maybe vote him out of office next time there's an election for that position and hope to straighten it out. Thus, let me explain this all part of the awful truth about voting. Thus, by registering to vote and then voting, you solidify the legal arrangement we've been talking about. It becomes evidence that you requested and accept such a legal arrangement. It is therefore self-evident that no matter which side of the election or voting process you fall upon, you have, by your own actions, absent a timely objection to those legal realities in place, agreed to abide by the outcome of the voting process. So, I know that's a mouthful. Let me talk about it a little bit. Because you registered to vote, and these of course are all your own actions. You registered to vote, then you go and vote, and then you said, you say, well, this is, of course can be used as evidence that you agreed to all this. Because remember what I said originally a little while back? I said that all the jurisdiction exercised over you comes from you. It's because you agreed to this legal arrangement. Okay? So this leads up to the idea, well, do you have standing to complain? If you agree to the arrangement and then you register to vote and then you vote, and then because of the vote this person wins and now he's your mouthpiece and now he speaks for you, and of course you realize there's two sides to every election. There's got to be, if somebody wins, somebody loses. So you can vote for people to get in or out of office, or you can vote for an issue to become law or not become law, or there's all kinds of ways this can come out. But there's no guarantee that it's going to come out your way. If you vote and your side wins and it comes out the way you want it, well, then you're happy. If you vote and you lose and it doesn't come out the way you want it, well, then you're unhappy. But that's not the point. The point is not your happiness or your unhappiness. The point is, did you agree to abide by the outcome of the voting process and the election? And the answer is yes. And how much then can you complain if it didn't come out the way you wanted? Well, the answer is you can complain for all the good it will do you. But, like some people, the vote didn't come out right, so they went ahead and had a riot and demonstration and whatever else they did out there, they threw a big fit. Well, you don't get to throw big fits like that when you have agreed to all this and it didn't come out your way. Okay, I get it. Didn't come out your way, you didn't like it. But you agreed to this. You agreed to be bound by this. Well, and then that's not very consistent when you say, well, I agree to all this, and if I lose, I still agreed to this voting process and this election process, and I agreed to be held to the outcome of it, and then you throw a big fit because it didn't come out your way and riot and things like that. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, my cameraman's making faces. He knows it doesn't make any sense, Anyway, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Okay, let's go on. You are in fact stating by operation of law that you support having whatever the issue may be or whatever the office or position that you voted for is properly something that can be decided by an election or voting process. That's another wrinkle to all this. By voting, by registering to vote and voting, you are also saying, maybe without knowing it, but it is binding by, they call it by operation of law. It is binding that whatever it is you voted for, you're automatically agreeing by your own actions, free will actions. You're saying, this is something that is properly to be voted on. Because, there is a situation where you might say, well, that's not something that I think should be voted on. A lot of people maybe don't go there, but there is that situation that can be there. And they say, well, yeah, but wait a second. This is something that maybe shouldn't even be voted on, and yet we're voting on it. Well, what do we do about that? What do we do about it? Are we still bound by it, even though it's something that shouldn't be voted on? It's not even something that ought to be the subject of a vote, but yet it was voted on, and then if it turns out to be something I don't like, what do I do then? If I'm unhappy, do I have standing to object? Or am I bound by this thing you've been telling me that I agreed to all this? Well, yeah, you are. You are bound by your agreement to the whole process, the whole legal relationship that's in place. And like I said, of course you can go with your friends and you can have a little bitch session and say, well, I don't like this, and your friend says, I don't like it either, but, for all the good that does. The fact of the matter is, the legal relationship and the actions you took bind you to it. It's something to really think about while we're talking about all this. A lot of people, that's why I call it the awful truth about voting. I should have called it the awful truth about voting that you didn't think about. You just were told you want to be a good citizen, vote and do your duty and do your civic duty and if you don't vote, well, what are you complaining about? You didn't even exercise your right to vote, so why are you complaining? Well, that may be what you have been told it was all about. That's not really the way the cookie crumbles. It's not really the way the cookie crumbles, and I'm gonna show you why. These facts become quite important as we proceed to address the subject matter. Be aware that as things stand now, even if you don't register to vote, and you don't even participate in the election or the voting process itself, you will be deemed to be bound by the election and voting outcome anyway. We can reestablish our standing to object. In the law it's called standing to object. However, by a timely notice of objection to the legal arrangement that's in place. If you don't object in a timely manner, that's another rule that I talk about when I'm talking about law. Failure to object in a timely manner is deadly. You need to object in a timely manner. Okay? Important to remember. So, we're going to be, I'm going to talk more about this objection, legal objection. Thus, through not registering to vote and then not voting and filing a timely objection, you preserve the option to object to the legal arrangement, which is presumed to have your full agreement and acceptance. This is another rule. Silence denotes agreement. If you fail to object and you remain silent, it denotes agreement. You say, well, I didn't say anything. Why does it denote agreement? Well, it does. That's the way it works. You mean when I don't say something, that means that I agree? Yeah, that's pretty much what it means. So if you don't agree with something, you need to speak up. And you need to do so by a timely legal objection. Otherwise, like I said here, it's presumed to have your full agreement and acceptance. In recent times, rumors were circulating about having mandatory vote registration and mandatory voting. Be aware it is not wise to support a proposal for that. The reason for that is that we should preserve our right not to register to vote, thereby protecting our option not to vote, which of course you should have the option to vote or not vote, which in effect further preserves our right to timely and subsequent objections. If you don't go through this process, now the law is really specific about some of this, you know. The longer you remain silent, even if you didn't register to vote and didn't vote, you will still be deemed to be bound by the vote anyway that you didn't even register for or vote in. Because you have there's been previous evidence to show that you've agreed to this whole legal arrangement. And if you don't do something to let them know that no, you don't agree to it, well then it just goes on and it just keeps on having jurisdiction over you anyway. All these steps have to be taken. Some people are of the opinion that if you don't register to vote and you are not a good, then you are not a good citizen. And you have somehow failed in your civic duties. That notion is generally followed by the belief that if you fail in your voting duties and obligations, then you have no valid position from which to object. It's like, well, you didn't vote, you don't have any right to complain. You know, at least if you voted and it went against you, then you would have the right to complain. And you say, well, at least I did what I was supposed to do. I put in my 5 cents worth and voted. It went against me, and now I've got the right to complain, by golly. You know, well, not exactly. That's not exactly the way it works legally. In regular life, you know, in regular goings on, yeah, it works that way maybe. But legally is different. Legally, it has a completely different application and an understanding to it. The truth is exactly the opposite. By registering and voting, you have, by your own actions, agreed to whatever the election and voting process may bring. That's the truth. Okay? Thus weakening or removing your standing to object platform. In law, see the doctrine of estoppel or the legal condition in the nature of estoppel. Now, estoppel basically says that if you are asserting a position that you already did things to which show that you don't have a standing to you don't have any standing to maintain this assertion of the position, because I'll give you an example. If you're asserting the position that you don't think it's right that you are required to have a driver's license, but it is then found out that you went to DMV, studied the driver's manual, took the driver's test, paid for, also you applied for the driver's license, took the test, passed it, paid for the license, and then got the license. All of that stuff stops you, that's why they call it estoppel. You're stopped from asserting the position that it's unfair for you to have the driver's license because you requested it. You requested it, paid for it, passed the test, studied for it, and all that. Now, how are you going to maintain the position that you shouldn't be forced to have, you shouldn't be required to have this driver's license when you went and asked for it? You see, when you went and asked for it. Now, there is a legal way around some of that, but I'm not going to get into it. But all I'm saying, I'm just showing you kind of what estoppel is about. If you do things by your own actions which undoes your complaint, you are stopped from continuing with the complaint, basically, your legal complaint, because you pretty much did it to yourself. The same principle is at work with all of this voting and registering to vote and all that. The same principle. You did it. You agreed to it. You then registered. You then voted. How are you going to then complain about how the vote came out, or even if it didn't come out your way. How are you going to complain about it? You agreed to all of that. You took steps. Your own actions are being used against you. And they say, we're going to stop you from continuing this frivolous complaint because it doesn't hold water under these conditions. That's called estoppel. Okay, since I was talking about driver's licenses, I'm going to talk about it for a little bit. Not much, just a little bit, just to give you an idea. Now, remember when I'm talking about this, I am not saying that I'm telling you not to have a driver's license. I'm not telling you that. I'm just analyzing, I'm just scrutinizing the legal things that are involved here. A driver's license, also known as an operator's license, which you request, apply for, pass a test for, and pay to get. The courts have said that a driver's license is evidence of consent to be regulated. Let me say that again. A driver's license is evidence of consent to be regulated. I want you to think about that. That's what legal professionals have said a driver's license is. What we don't understand is you may well ask, and you'd be right to ask, you say, well, how did this driver's license stuff even get started? Where did it come from? What's the origin of this driver's license? Well, the origin of it is that it is a license to engage in commercial use, in a commercial activity. Originally, a driver was somebody who drove people around, originally in a horse and buggy, and drove people around for money, for hire. And that was a driver. The guy that drove you around. And here comes the horse and buggy, and you say, well, can you horse and buggy me over there? And they say, yeah, I can. You're going to pay me the money. And your driver then drives you from point A to point B to where you wanted to go. That is a commercial activity for hire. He's a horse and buggy driver for hire. Okay, using the public roadway for profit and gain, as opposed to a private person using his own private conveyance. Today we would call that a vehicle. Using his own private conveyance for private use to go from one point to another. There's a complete difference there between the two. If you're using your own vehicle for private use to get from point A to point B, you're not on the road commercially, you're not using it for profit or gain, do you need a license to do that? I'm talking strictly through a legal lens. Do you need a license to do that? And the answer is no, you don't. No, you don't. Now, am I saying that you shouldn't have a license? No, I'm not. I'm telling you that there's a difference between these two things. Okay? So if you're a truck driver, moving product from one place to another, using the roadway commercially for profit and gain by moving product in your truck, is that something that is properly subject to commercial regulation? And the answer is yes. What is happening is, in the legal sense, what is happening is they are putting commercial regulation and commercial duties upon private people in private activity. That's what's happening from strictly a legal point of view. Okay, a lot of people don't realize that, and I think it's important that you realize the difference. All right, inherent right. What is when you're doing all of this stuff privately? What is that based upon? How can you do it privately and not be doing it commercially? What inherent right is that based on? Well, it's based on the inherent right of movement and locomotion from one place to the other. Private locomotion and movement from one place to the other. And it is an inherent right, unless you want to stay boxed up in your house for the rest of your life. Of course, as a private person engaged in private locomotion from place to place, you will be liable for damages to life and property you may cause. This is also what right here. Rights and responsibilities on the board. You can't have rights without responsibility. Just remember that I said that before in another recording. I'm saying it again now. There's no such thing as rights without responsibility. So when you exercise this private right of moving privately from one place to another by your inherent right of movement and locomotion, you carry the responsibility for not causing damage to life and property that you may cause. You have to make sure you don't do that. For example, no texting while driving is a good idea. Driving while intoxicated, that's also something that you won't do. You see, that you shouldn't do, because that's not responsible. And if you are acting with, let's say you're out there moving from place to place without a license because you're not involved in commercial commerce and activity, well, you better make sure that you act responsible, that you're not going down the road and not watching the road, or that you've been drinking, and then you hit somebody because you're drunk. You see, those are things that you are responsible for. And just because you don't have a license doesn't mean you're not responsible for those things. You are. You absolutely are. I was going to talk about insurance. I'll mention real quickly. I want you to think about this. The way the laws are right now, the state is requiring you to buy a product from the private sector. That product is insurance. And they call it financial responsibility law. You see, it all fits back into what we've been talking about. Now, you start to have a problem when the government can tell any citizen or any inhabitant or private person with inherent rights that they must buy a particular product from a private vendor. Now, I'm not going to go into it deeply. I think I've said enough to get your mind working. How does the government require, let's say that you were building furniture, and the government passes a law and says, we're going to pass a law that says that you have to buy furniture from Mike Benjamins Jr., who's making furniture. And everybody goes, that's ridiculous. You can't order people to have to buy the product of a private manufacturer or seller. You can't do that. Well, they're doing exactly that when they tell you have to buy insurance. And that's a whole issue and study in and of itself I won't go into, but I just want you to understand there's something already wrong when the government tells you have to buy a private product from a private vendor. You got yourself a problem right there. Something's already wrong legally. It may work out good for when there's accidents and this and that. By the way, just because you're moving privately without a license doesn't mean you can't have insurance. The government can't tell you have to buy it, but if you want to have it, you say, yeah, maybe I better have some insurance just in case. Well, that's okay. You can have insurance. Nobody said you can't go down to an insurance company and say, give me some insurance. I'll buy it voluntarily because I want to be safer, and if something does happen, I'm covered. There's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. Okay. Am I suggesting that you should drive without a license? No, I'm not saying that. That we are engaged in a legal study and we're looking at issues. I'm not saying that you should drive without a license. Don't get confused. We're just looking at issues. We're just analyzing. We're doing some legal analysis. Okay. Don't forget, I was a police officer. I was serious about my job, and in those days, I was one to be looking into the statutes and seeing what the statutes said. And you can be sure that when I was a police officer, if you messed up on my watch, you would indeed have a young Pastor Mike after you with his ticket book in hand. You can indeed be sure that would be the case. But that has nothing to do with what I'm talking to you about now. I want the streets to be safe. I want things to go smoothly. I don't want people getting run over. I don't want, one of the things that really pet peeve most cops is drunk driving. No cops like drunk driving because a lot of bad things happen over drunk driving. People are irresponsible. That has very little to do with whether or not a private person should be commercially regulated. I hope you understand what I'm telling you here. Okay. The reality is that because various laws are voted into existence, either directly or indirectly, to which a citizen may later want to object, a legal condition exists where the government authorities can look you straight in the face and say, if you don't like this law, whatever it is, why did you bring such a law about, and why don't you do something to have it removed from the law? Now, there's a reason why they can say that. Actually, when I was a police officer, I actually saw that happening, where officers said exactly that to people. Because the officer can also say, well, I'm just required to enforce the laws that exist. Don't look at me. I didn't create these laws. And see that badge? I'm supposed to enforce these laws, and I'm just required to enforce these laws. Don't look at me. I didn't do it. You see, well, why is this possible? Why is it possible for an officer to legitimately make statements like that? Well, it's because you either asked for the law to exist. This is there ought to be a law scenario. You know, you've probably heard of it. You know, people actually have laws that are named after people. You see, I won't go into specific names, but some of the laws that were asked for, it says, we want you guys to make a law, and we're going to call it, you know, let's call John Doe's law, and it becomes a law, and it's called John Doe's law. We asked for it. We say, there ought to be a law, okay? Or you voted for government representatives who brought the law into existence, or you directly voted for whatever the law at issue might be. You see? Now, this takes us back to this thing about voting for people who then speak for you. When you do that, now these people make laws. You can say, well, I didn't make the law. These representatives and these people, these government politicians and stuff, they made the law, but they did it in your name. They did it in the name of the people. So it traces right back to you again. You see, so they say, well, you made the law. That's why the police officer says, well, why did you bring this law about? And he says, I didn't. He says, yes, you did. You voted for the guy who then voted for the law that now exists, that I now have to enforce. And he says, oh, well, you mean all that traces back to me? And he says, yes, it does. And he says, if you don't like that law, why did you have it come about? You see, now people don't want to back engineer things like that and say, boy, you mean I'm to blame for this? You mean it's my fault? Well, yeah, it's your fault. Especially if you look at it legally, it's your fault. Not you alone, you and the rest of the people who voted for it. So, if it's your fault, what standing do you have to complain? And you say, well, yeah, let me think about that. Maybe you got a point there. Legally, the government representatives create laws in the name of the people. You participated in, supported, and agreed to the legal arrangement that I've been talking about all this time. Therein lies the foundation of the phrase, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Isn't it nice to know that the legal club being used upon you and your fellow citizens comes from you and them? Let me say that again. Isn't it nice to know that the legal club being used upon you and your fellow citizens comes from you and them? Okay. I've beat you up pretty good now. Let's go on. I better interject, because you might get the idea that I'm against democratic government and that I am telling people not to vote, and that and then they say, well, that's just great, Pastor Mike. You're telling us you don't like democracy, and it's not in tune with God, and you don't like the voting. You keep telling us what all the problems with voting are. So what, do you have something that's better? Well, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that. Because I understand the dynamics of why people vote. I understand why they think, I got to have a say in my government, for God's sake. How am I going to have any say in the way I'm ruled. Personally, I prefer democratic government to a corrupt non-democratic government. I prefer it. But you know what I prefer more than those? I prefer God to be my king. I just want to make that clear. Okay. I fully understand that for many citizens, the voting process seems all they have to exercise some form of control and influence upon the way they are governed. Believe me, I get that. People rightly ask, if I can't or don't vote, then what power will I have over the way I am governed? Again, a really good question. Let me say that if government would leave Bible believers alone to live according to God's word, acknowledging their right to have access to God's kingship and dominion jurisdiction pursuant to a sound no-harm rule. I'm going to talk about the no-harm rule. Okay, because just because we want God as our king doesn't mean we can act with impunity to harm other people. Doesn't mean that at all. There has to be a no-harm rule. It's called the no-harm rule in the law. Okay, so is it true that if I, for example, have God as my king, that I won't follow a no-harm rule and I say, well, I'm not going to go out and harm other people just because God's my king. That doesn't give me the right to go harming everybody. No, there has to be a no-harm rule in place. Then I would be satisfied. If the government say, okay, you got it, like I said, Pastor Mike, you got a legitimate complaint. You want God as your king. You say you're going to agree to the no-harm rule, which I would agree to the no-harm rule. And you're going to say that you want your inherent rights and you don't want the government, you don't want to be bound by a majority vote over your inherent rights. By the way, one of your inherent rights, one of your most important inherent rights, is the right to have a real relationship with the sovereignty of God. That's one of the most important inherent rights that you'll ever have. There are other important rights. You guys know that. I made another recording about inherent rights, so you know there's a whole list of them. But that's one of the most important. I want to have a real and true and genuine relationship with the sovereignty and kingship of God. Because I'm a believer in God and I want that. And I believe that I have an inherent right to it. Okay. In the absence of access to God's kingship, which I firmly believe and assert we have an inherent right to, I support the democratic process, although it has various problems which have long been associated with it. I'm not telling anyone not to be involved in democracy or voting. No, I'm just informing you of what it means legally when you are so involved. All right, let's move on to the main point. I wanted to make in relation to the awful truth about voting. In a previous post that I did on Facebook, this is at code 2018A0246, entitled Inherent Rights and Voting, I wrote the following. I wrote that pre-existing, inherent, natural, human, and God-given inalienable rights, that's up here, of course, also on this board, inalienable rights, hereinafter referred to simply as inherent rights. What I'm saying is, when I say inherent rights, I mean all this stuff. I mean the pre-existing rights, that they're pre-existing, they're inherent, they're natural, they're human rights, and they're God-given inalienable rights. So when I say inherent rights, I mean all that stuff. Also, the late Justice Scalia also called them pre-political rights. And I mean all of that. By pre-existing, I mean it pre-exists the very Constitution itself. It pre-exists the Second Amendment. It pre-exists the federal government. It pre-exists state government. Justice Scalia said it's pre-political. He says it pre-exists political government. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. All right, now let's keep going. Must be viewed and understood differently from man-made legislated rights. These inherent rights must be viewed differently from legislated man-made rights, which are grants of man. Carefully consider and understand, my friends and brethren, that genuine inherent rights, in the scheme of things, were never meant to stand or fall upon the unstable platform of a majority vote of men. It was never meant. I'm going to read it again because it's that important. Genuine inherent rights, in the scheme of things, were never meant to stand or fall upon the unstable platform of a majority vote of men. That holds true for the individual, the group, the minority, and even the majority that stands upon their inherent inalienable rights. Such inherent rights exist beyond the predation of a majority agreement vote of man or people, regardless of the logic, reason, and rationale upon which it may think to be justified. Okay, at this point we're going to take a break, and then we're going to start in again in part 2 of this instruction.